Awesome. Oh, actually, it's all right.
All right, y'all.
Trains to be closer.
Where is she?
She's down in southern Louisiana, just north of North House train is.
Yeah,
She's on the north end of it.
okay, upstream. When the flooding happens.
I thought somebody had joined that.
She didn't find out in 2 weeks, but she's admitted to the nursing school.
Well, nice to get the surgery done before she has to help other people.
She said she wanted to be $1 million operation.
Ah, amen. The insurance covers most of it. All of it. How fantastic.
She's thinking about it.
So it hasn't put her on disability.
Oh,
That's cool.
only death. She's got a long spring.
Well,
Yeah.
well, there's a chair by Richard right there if you want it.
Oh, she is.
Oh,
Sir Lane will be here just any minute.
Oh.
Last night I came to the all ages movie that they showed.
Oh.
How
How was the turnout for that?
So got off. But what was really funny was they had a laptop that was gonna show the movie. Well, we have to have this other laptop to show. But see if we can get that laptop to show. Well, how about everybody sit around that laptop and we can hear what we can see. So everybody read the next time they're gonna get the technology.
So there wasn't a lot of people there? Good morning, good morning. There's Roy.
I
Come on.
forget whether Mitch was bringing the machines or the machines were against the Mitch. Pretty fun. They kind of made it really well. It was one of those things. that really came from a lot of jokes are strictly adult. Not sexy or anything. The kids didn't understand. Yeah. For somebody's age, it was cute to get a clue what was going on. Yeah.
She lives on the she went to a movie one night. She was up there. And this child was trying to escape from somebody that was running here and running there. No, all around. That in the back of the back. Was probably very. She burst out laughing and it was.
Be fun. That is pretty. Did you make? Wow.
You could.
Copy to pen. It was beautiful. I love it. Everybody ought to have a new hip. No, it really does make me mobile. Just
There's two people I've never saw. There's two people I've never seen here before. Okay.
How are you?
I am doing beautifully. We can move over so you can have it.
Yeah.
Another chair here. Yeah, you could fit another chair here.
Hi, Molly. Oh, there's another one. Lane, you're doing really good with Zoom here. Usually you'll get this many. Very good.
Tell me when you're ready to go. Jim.
11. Yeah. Stand it up.
Seems like a good time. We have here with us our old Wayne Leckman, who we all know very well, if you want to. He's here to talk today on grief and depression, I believe. And, he's retired, I believe. He's out of town almost every week anymore. So I envy him for that. And with that, we'll have a little prayer. I'm tasked with that too.
Right.
Thank you, Lord, for bringing us together, for having this place to come to and concern people. Very important subject that we seem to be paying more attention to lately to help us to understand what's being said and have empathy for those that are having trouble.
Bad connection.
Okay, good.
Somebody must have a parrot.
This sounds, whatever iPad 61 is.
Anyway, hello. Good morning. I am just
Bang into me.
I'm just back from Churchill, Canada,
Oh,
where I went to see the Aurora Borealis. We were there 4 nights and we saw it every night. If you've never seen it, it's an awesome event. Yeah, my wife makes pictures, and I Googled back in 1958. My father was a volunteer on the International Geophysical Year, and he was supposed to go out in our backyard every night and look for the Aurora Borealis in Albuquerque. For people who know about the Aurora Borealis, Albuquerque is not where you
Know where you are.
But one night he came back into the house and he said, "Come out here," to my brother and I. We came out, and there in the northern sky was a red, it was covered full of red. And I thought the northern lights danced.
Mhm.
So I thought this isn't northern lights. This is fallout from a nuclear bomb. I Googled it when I got home, and it was the northern lights.
well, really?
In
That's hard up.
1958, there was such an eruption from the sun that it got all the way to 18 degrees north of the equator. Wow. And the United States Navy ship saw it up there. So, but it was such an amazing event that I interrupting my talk to talk about it. As those of you who have sat with me in a situation like this before, you may know that one of the ways that I like to start is to talk about any concerns or questions or issues that any of you may have, thoughts that you may have about the subject of depression and grief. We had a wonderful presentation from Paul Hopkins, and I forgot the woman's name.
Jude.
That I was here for at the beginning of February, and then they presented again on the next week, which I missed because I was out of town. And they covered a lot of issues about grief, and the program that they were talking about was a very excellent program. So you may have fewer questions because of those excellent talks, but I'd just like to get from each person something you'd like to hear me address or talk about today while we talk about depression and grief and mental illness in general, mental health in general. So Kathy, do you have anything that's on your mind about this subject?
I have a special grief. I grieve I lost my hearing.
Your hearing?
Yeah, my
I'm
hearing.
losing mine, so
I
I
saved
was
the
checking.
past 40 years, and now I cannot even keep the right key. And it is really kind of getting me down a little bit.
Well, Kathy brings up the important point that grief is often something that we experience when we lose someone.
I can't do that.
A profound experience when we lose something else, like our hearing, or our capacity to think clearly, or having a loved one that's having one of those difficulties. And I'm in the state of denial at the moment about my hearing loss. So there's a process that we can talk about in this, but Jenny.
I was thinking the same thing with a different specific. When you say grief the word, I think people go to widows, widowers, that group. But it can often be, and I think usually is something that we've lost that we don't even realize maybe was that important until it was gone. And all of a sudden we're going, why am I feeling blump, blump, blump? And you go, oh, well, it's because of, and sometimes I think the loss is recognized retroactively, if you will, once we figure out.
What is it that you're thinking about specifically when you say that?
Specifically, my daughter's health. I mean, those of you who know me, she's been going downhill since birth. But we've reached a new impasse of if you do X, Y is going to get worse, and if you do Y, X is going to get worse. And so, and I can't make that choice for her, obviously. But part of what I'm grieving is I can't make that choice. I'm the mommy. I'm supposed to be in charge. And she's a 35-year-old woman. I can't make that choice for her. Yeah.
Is she able to?
Yes.
That's good.
Most days. Yes. Your turn. My turn. Talk about grief. I have experienced when I was 4 losing a baby sister, and that's hung heavy. I was only 4. I was with my baby sister. My dad was screaming. She killed her baby. That's how I've always been. And 4 years old, I had to take charge of it. And I was falling off my daddy's up on control. So I run out and lay down. And the truck driver came in and he said, "Man, you didn't kill the baby. God needed an angel." Good little girl. So that's heavy.
Wow, that's a very
Long time ago, but still, like a 4-year-old Tom, my other dad wants me to get here and get started cars out because he got the paper. Maybe on hold. And then to call my little sister, who's 2. Here it is, middle of the night. There's 3 feet of snow on the ground. Well, it was tough, but I remember that truck I was saying. And then to me, God needed an angel, so. I didn't get it. Very traumatic. 4-year-old. Yeah.
Richard? You had any losses? Losses. Have you ever lost somebody that you love?
Mother and father.
Your father lasted a good long time. 98. Donna?
Excuse me just a second. May I say something?
Yeah.
I'm having trouble hearing, Lane, so if you could rephrase some of people's comments, that would help us a lot here.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear.
Okay,
Okay,
we'll try to speak up then.
Okay.
thank you so much.
Kathy, she talked about losing her hearing. And Ginny Routman talked about not being able to be in charge, in control of her daughter's health. And I forgot your first name. Lily. No. And Billy talked about a very traumatic experience she had when she was 4 years old, when her baby sibling died in Colorado in 3 feet of snow. And Richard talked about how he had lost his parents. And I just asked John.
Yeah, so I lost as my new wife calls her, starter wife, about 20 years ago, to Alzheimer's. She got it at the age of, she died at the age of 60. So, and so that was really hard. It's still hard. And my new wife lost her husband through Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. You probably know what that is. It's like a mad cow disease.
It's where your brain stops working quite as well.
Well, it's where your brain gets holes in it versus plaques and stuff. So that's originally what they thought my wife had. Anyway, so we joke about this. Do we have where's the keys? Are they in the freezer? Things of this nature. So I think that's the biggest grief I have. I lost my brother in 2017 to a stroke, and he was 4.5 years younger than us. So, but he was in Maine, and so I didn't see him a lot. Anyway. So when the holidays come, we have our issues because we go back in memory with our former spouses.
So far as we've talked, it's clear that the grief can show up for lots of different reasons. And in the case of your wife, your first wife, your starter wife,
Right. Yeah.
she lost her capacity to think as clearly and remember before she died.
Well, she couldn't even speak.
Right. So she lost quite a bit before she lost her life. And mentioned that his younger brother died as well, just 5 or 6 years ago.
Yep.
And which Billy talked about as well, and losing her baby sibling, and who we lose and how we lose them and how often we see the person that we've lost all play an important role in what the nature of our grief is. And I just want to underline those points that you brought up, John.
Well, my son has had 2 major head traumas. He was hit by a car from 17 feet and landed on his head. And then a few years later, his best friend hit him in the head with a baseball bat. And so, and he's definitely suffered both of those things. So he's my big concern.
And we just heard that your first name again? Janet, that's right. Janet's son had a serious head injury when he was, how old was he, Janet?
He was in middle school. I think he was in like 7th grade.
7th grade. And then subsequently got hit on the head with a baseball bat by a friend.
And I feel guilty about that because I saw the baseball bat sitting there and thought about putting it away and just never got to it. So that also brings.
And that brings up another issue. She mentioned she felt guilty that she hadn't put the baseball bat aside. And so often, even though it may have not really played that important part in the whole thing, the issue of guilt comes up.
Sure.
With certain losses and certain things. Yeah.
I've had a number of losses. They get easier. You know, they don't go away. But I'm curious about people that have what they call clinical depression, where it's not a trauma that's caused it. Is that a permanent issue usually? Or is that something you can outgrow? I know it can be treated, but can you outgrow it?
Okay, so the question is about depression, and wanting to know more about depression. I'm wondering if it's something that you can outgrow. She knows that treatment of depression is something that can be done, but can you outgrow it? Can you get beyond it? Some significant way.
And grandson is self-treating for it.
And mentioned also that she has a grandson who's treating himself. How is he doing it? Marijuana.
It's physical, it's not, you know, it's not an addiction. It's not only parts and learning.
Brings up a couple of issues. One is how people try to cope with loss and cope with difficulties, sometimes using things that are appropriate and quite helpful and doing it in a helpful way, and other times doing it in a way that makes the problem worse. And so that's Bruce.
Well, I had a lot of losses in my life of people. A couple of brothers a couple of years ago, and both were had mental problems, which is and there is some guilt associated with that. But of course, more recently, my mom died 5 years ago. That anniversary just came up, and that did well, you know. We had been saving her ashes, spread in the mountains as she requested it, and it turned out my brother-in-law, a year and a half ago, they both put out together, and they were, you know, I would say, God bless my mom, because I think none of them took me down terribly, and they do hate it. But I would say she gave us the tools to get through those things. Another thing that I think I've mentioned before is moving around in the military. You learn to leave things behind. You feel well. It happens all your life. You know, as a kid, we moved inside of every 2 years. New friends, old friends. Get past that. The other thing, those are all far enough in the past where I've sort of moved on. This getting older thing. They come to this church and feel different. But it is, my ears are going, and other things, you know, but I'm pretty much at the beginning of it, but I'm great. It's not all easy.
So this is my first time teaching on Zoom. So any comments from the those of you out there in Zoom land, just speak up. Did you all hear Bruce, or should I repeat what he said?
I did. I heard Bruce.
Okay, because he was close to the microphone, I thought that maybe. But
Yeah.
he talked about, you know, grief about his mother, about 2 brothers that had mental illness as well, about growing older, like several of us in the room, losing his hearing. Brought up a number of issues and mentioned that the time makes a difference. Interestingly, just this morning as I came into church, I was thinking about how his mother was in a Sunday school class that often had me come and speak. And I was just missing her myself because she was such a lively character. And even though it's been 5 years, it's still a loss. Toby, you're next.
Well, family, 2 boys and 3 girls. My father was an advertising company, New York City, And he was, once he died, he had cancer. And we went down to see him, and he thought, I'm gonna get out of this bed. And that's the word he said. "I'm gonna make it," and he didn't make it. And, so it was a shock to everybody in the family. And, I still think about it. And why?
How old were you when that happened, Toby?
I was, let's see, probably about 15.
So Toby said when he was a teenager, his father died. And it was a major loss, and his father was saying he was going to get up out of the bed, but he had pancreatic cancer. And even at the time, Toby was pretty sure that his father wasn't going to get up out of the bed, and he didn't. And so that still sits with him all these many years later. Over 50 years, I'm sure, and probably more. Susan.
Well, I'm kind of with Bruce. As we get older, we lose opportunities, and I think, I just want to keep doing everything. That's just isn't always possible.
So Susan mentioned that getting older, she votes with Bruce. That's a situation where we begin to lose things and people as well. And just the opportunity to do things isn't always as easily accessible as it is when you're younger. Clara.
I would say with age comes that cumulative growth. Every time you lose somebody else, revisit all the other ones you lost.
Yeah.
It's a well, it's still.
Yeah.
And so Clara is saying that the older we get, the more people we have lost, and there's a cumulative impact. I can certainly relate to that because I just lost my high school college roommate a year ago. And I met him when my life was opening up. And now that he's dead, I'm getting a different impression about what's happening with life. But still trying to keep it opening up. I don't know your name. Jenny.
So many of you probably know my friends, Marshall and Joan Paris.
Oh, yeah.
They passed away both of them in 2020 during the pandemic. So it's very difficult to see them and visit with them.
Pardon me.
Mom had pretty severe dementia. And I think about when they had to separate them because my dad got COVID and into a separate place, and my mother was without him. And that makes me very sad.
And Jane just explained how her parents died in 2020 and losing them has been hard. But what was really hard about it was during COVID, she couldn't be with them as much as she would have liked to. And at one point when her father got COVID, he had to be separated from her mother. And it still makes her quite sad to think about it. And the Zoom thing is sort of a strange thing.
Oh, my biggest losses were family, and so I don't have any in paper clothes. And I got divorced, and it was a very difficult thing. And I feel grief about all of it, even when I'm not recent.
Was that, did you all hear that?
No, I missed that.
She said that she's lost family and she also was divorced. And even though all of those things happened a long time ago, there's still an occasion for sadness and grief when she thinks about it. It's reminded of that.
Good assessment.
Dan?
Like everyone here, I suffered grief through the loss of family and friends and pets and so forth. But just for a little bit of a different perspective, one of the losses that we have recently suffered is a very good friend
who kind of submerged because of the COVID. And we will never see him again. He's alive and well, everything's fine, but he is gone from our lives. And that's really a too bad thing. That something, you know, that isn't really a loss is.
Were you able to hear Dan? Talked about how because of COVID, a friend that's still alive and still well is not a part of their life anymore. And even though he's there, he's not accessible. And that feels like a slightly different kind of loss, but a significant loss all the same.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have lost 2 husbands. And I lost 2 cousins early in life. And of course, my parents are both gone, but they lived into their 90s. And I think that I miss the cousins more than anyone else. Most recent trials and tribulations have been with having enough time to do all the things that need to be done. It requires more, you know. And side, we went to the doctor the other day. She gave him some memory tests, and he did much better than we expected him to do. So we're thinking that perhaps his problem is if it doesn't interest him at the moment. He's an extremely healthy. It's started all over the place, and it still is.
And, you know, this to demonstrate loss here. I know you're reading like the back of my hand. So Virginia just talked about how she has lost 2 husbands. She lost 2 cousins that she really misses. And even those losses long ago still have an impact. And she's talking about how she doesn't seem to have as much time to do all the things she needs to do or wants to do as she once did. And then she shared an anecdote about how her husband is taking more of her time, although he recently had a memory test at the doctor's and did fairly well. And then I demonstrated my memory loss by forgetting Virginia's name.
In the last couple of months sometime, I woke up one day and realized that I suddenly felt old and bald. Yeah. Dealing with corporations and having to do so much on the internet that used to be really takes a lot of time. And with my visual difficulties, I'm constantly clicking on the wrong thing and back up. Yeah.
You know, I'm talking about how sometimes working with computers and doing some other things kind of makes you clearer about your vulnerabilities. And I think that's a very important point too, is the loss of past skills and your present sense of vulnerability is a cause of grief. Terry?
Anything or anyone I've lost. I think my losses have certainly been more unbearable than many people's. I'm a bit with Bruce, except that growing up on the mission field instead of living through the military, you learn to leave things and people behind. And as far as memory is concerned, I've been forgetful since I was a kid.
So Terry's demonstrating a useful defense mechanism, which is minimization. He just said that he's had a lot of losses, but doesn't think he's had particular problems above and beyond what anybody would have with a loss. And growing up in the mission field, did a lot of moving, just like Bruce did when he was a child in the military, with his parents in the military. And you brought up an important, interesting thing, which is you learn by having this repeated experience, ways to deal with it. Sometimes you learn good things to deal, ways to deal with it. And sometimes you learn bad things about how to deal with it, but you still are learning and attempting to cope with things that are important. And our young friends as children that we're moved away from are important losses. They don't get emphasized, they don't get underlined, but they're still important losses. Barbara.
Yeah.
Me coming here was more the depression in. We have a close family member who is suffering from depression, and I'm just looking for guidance in how to support her through that.
Barbara is being generous enough to bring us to the topic of our lecture today, which is grief and depression. And she's looking for ways to cope with depression in a friend who is causing her concern at the moment. I don't know your name.
I'm Jim.
Oh, you're Janet. I know you too. Yeah. I know you well. Yeah. You just didn't recognize you. Any issue that you'd like me to address or that you have in your experience around grief and loss? And when was that?
10 years.
10 years ago. For Janet, losing her son is very clearly a very important and painful event that is still causing her pain. She didn't say that, I just said it. I could see it in her face. Okay, Ron?
The thing that causes me grief is the loss of my son Philip, who died not too long ago. And both Janet and I experienced the same kind of a loss. Both of our sons died when they were only 41 years old. And it's very hard to take. My son died of lymphomatic leukemia. And I did have the chance to see him just before he died. We got a telephone call from my oldest son up in Seattle and said, "Dad, you got to get there right away. Philip's not doing well at all." And all of my daughters, and we all landed in Seattle about the same time, about midnight. And they dropped me off at the hospital. I went in and I saw Philip for the last time. It is hard to lose a son or a daughter before you. And the same with Janet and her son also. It's out of order.
Right. And Ron is underlining the point that Janet made, but he's talking about losing Philip, his son, at the age of 41. And Janet said in the process of him saying that it's out of order, that we're supposed to go before our children. And Kathy Shee, who introduced herself at the beginning, knows about that because Steve, her son, died 23 years ago, maybe.
24 years ago,
24 years ago.
at the age of 44.
Just on that subject, I remember being out with Steve and his wife, and my wife who had cancer at the time. And Steve and Marilyn were talking about who was it harder on, them or those of us who were going to be losing them. And they decided we were having the harder time. They were. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they decided. But I appreciate all of you sharing and it helps me kind of think about how to say what I want to say. Back in 1915, for those of you who don't know, most of you do, but I'm a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. And so I studied people like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and many other people in my training to learn how to be as good a psychiatrist and psychotherapist as I could be. And there's an important paper that was written by Sigmund Freud in 1915. It was called Of Mourning and Melancholia.
Oh, yeah.
And by melancholia, he meant depression. And he was trying to talk about the difference between mourning or grieving and depression.
Yeah.
And in 1915, Sigmund Freud was living in Vienna in the middle of World War I. And he had two sons who were in the armed forces for the Austrian army, was worried about them. He was growing older himself, and he had lost a family member, I believe it was a daughter, and he was contemplating what the difference was between grief and depression. And in that article, he said several interesting things, one of which was that he thought that depression was more likely to happen if you had an ambiguous or ambivalent or problematic relationship with your lost person that you were losing. In other words, and it was sort of paradoxical to me because it would seem like it would be more traumatic to lose somebody who you loved dearly and didn't have any issues with. But from his point of view, he was suggesting that there were more problems inherent in losing somebody with whom you had conflict. Whether that's true or not, the other point that he makes is really important, and that is that you find a way to feel free and a place and places to feel free to talk about what you've been through. Because one of the models of dealing with things is to not talk. And I'll just use a personal example. My father was in the military in World War II, and he did not have a lot of patience for his 2-year-old son crying and complaining. So he used to say, if you don't shut up, I'm going to give you something to cry about. So I learned how not to cry. Then I became a psychotherapist. And I was in group therapies. And it seemed like the women in the groups I were in always had an easier time crying than I did. And after I watched enough of them cry and not die or have bad things happen or get beaten up by your father, I learned how to cry again. So probably around 1991 or 2, I was starting to be able to cry. So when my first wife was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1996, I cried. And I cried a lot. And I could cry again. But it was helpful. It was very useful to be able to just let those feelings flow and go. And in many different ways, we learn how not to let our feelings out and not to express ourselves. And one of the ways of defining a depression is where we get sort of stuck. We get stuck with feelings and we have a hard time expressing them. And that's a form of depression. And it's useful. And that's sometimes why grief counseling can be very helpful, is because you see other people who are grieving, you see other people who have had losses, and it gives you permission to feel and talk about your losses. One of the patients that I worked with for many years was a woman who at the time was younger than I am now, but older than I was then. And she had lost her husband to suicide, and he had been a psychiatrist. And she actually belonged to a local group here called Survivors of Suicide. It was called SOS. And she had me come and talk. And the very first time I talked to that group, I was overwhelmed because they started with, like we did today, introductions. And everybody went around the room. They didn't talk at length, but they said, I'm here because my son hung himself, or I'm here because my husband shot himself. And by the third or fourth time, and there were 30 people there that night, I was overwhelmed. So I took aside my notes and I just said, I'd like to learn more about what your experiences were like. And I have 2 questions. I asked 2 questions. And I was grateful that I had 2 questions in mind at the time, because I wanted to hear more from people, and I could tell they all needed to talk more. They all needed to express themselves. And so one of the important treatments when you find somebody who's gotten stuck in their grief is to make sure they find a way to be able to talk about it and discuss it. And 3 weeks ago, when Paul and Jay were here, they talked about, you know, helping families that have lost children grieve. And that's sometimes very hard to talk about, because if you believe you're not supposed to cry, how are you going to not cry? So these are very relevant issues when it comes to the process of grieving. And depression, which I was asked what depression is. Depression in the medical psychiatric language is called a affective disorder. And it's there with manic depression and with depression and with major and minor depression, which get different names. But it means that your feelings are stuck in your body, is the way I like to put it. You're sitting there and you're feeling stuck. And if you're not careful, you start to turn feelings on yourself. So a lot of times in depression, we see people saying things about themselves that are negative and not so positive. And that's a very important issue to address and to deal with. I remember I was doing group therapy with a group of people one time, and one of the women in the group had an alcoholic father, which was a cause of deep grief for her. And when he was drinking, he wasn't the sweetest guy. He would say mean things. And I had been in this group with this group of people for probably several months when I realized that she thought of herself as bad. I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person. Because she'd gotten that message when her father was drinking. And so I took a little bit of a risk. I didn't think it was a very big risk. Her name wasn't Martha, but I'll just say Martha. I said, how many people in this group think Martha's a bad person? Raise your hand. No hands went up. How many people in this group think Martha's a good person? Everybody's hand shot right up, because she was a lovely person. She looked at us like we were crazy. How could you think I'm a wonderful person? How could you think that? And so that simple intervention made some difference, but it wasn't enough. And so it was over time in that group process that she was able to hear different messages about who she was and how she was that were more real and more true to the situation. There's another phenomenon that is very interesting. It's called projective identification. Terry told me he had to leave, so he's leaving. Bye, Terry.
You gotta do Zoom.
And projective identification is where somebody is feeling something, and they're feeling it so intensely, they're projecting that feeling out, and they project it onto you. And you identify with it. And if you're not careful, you do it back.
Exactly.
I remember a patient who had learned as a child to hate herself. So she would come into the room and she would project this self-hatred. And I remember feeling like, geez, I'm beginning to hate her. In fact, I feel so angry with it that I want to hit her. And I, of course, was sitting in my chair with my legs folded, and I said, that wouldn't be very therapeutic. So, 2020, and I decided that I would radiate love. So I sat back in my chair and I looked at her and I just felt love. And this is a cause for a digression. I had an interesting experience when I did that. And I have an interesting experience that's reliably repeatable every time I do. So I'm now looking at Bruce with love. And over my right shoulder, I'm feeling someone looking at me with love. And it's a wonderful experience because I become a conduit for love. And in the process, I'm love myself. So that's one of the advantages of group therapy, in fact, is that people get to work with each other in the group and bring things like that to each other. And then I'm always looking for an opportunity to love Bruce anyway. But when you find somebody who's really seriously and severely depressed, I learned rather slowly that it really is a mind-altering illness. The way that the person begins to think about themselves is not realistic. It's not very honest. And if you can simply give somebody an antidepressant and it works, that's beautiful because it's quick, it happens. I was so into doing psychotherapy with people, and unlike a lot of psychiatrists, so hesitant to use medications if I didn't immediately think about it. I would have this experience every once in a while where the patient, after seeing me for a few weeks or months, would say, Dr. Leckman, don't you think I need an antidepressant? And I would say, you do. And I would prescribe it. And if it worked, it was wonderful because the medication somehow shifted all of that, but not with everyone. And the more complex and complicated a depression is, the harder it is for an antidepressant to work. And the more it's been integrated into a person's way of being and thinking, the harder it is for it to work. I recently was given a book by a friend, and the book was written by a man named John Bowlby. And John Bowlby is a famous English psychiatrist who had a lot to do with a theory called attachment theory, which characterizes the way that people attach to the significant others in their life in 4 or 5 different ways. But one of the best ways to attach is a secure attachment. And one of the worst ways to attach is an insecure attachment. So if say your parents aren't very secure and they can't attach to you in a solid way, you sort of pick that up and carry it with you. And John Bowlby had a lot of thoughts and talks about that theory.
Bowlby.
But the book that was given to me by a friend was a biography of Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, in case you didn't know, lost his mother when he was 8 years old. And he lost another child of his when she was very young, when she was 10. And all his life, he suffered psychosomatic symptoms, sometimes so badly that it kept him from doing his work and writing. And so this biography detailed all of that in this story. Sigmund Freud, when he talked about mourning and melancholia, talked about how people who have loss of significant people in their life early on often had a more traumatic experience. Like Billy talking about losing a young sibling when she was 4 years old, when she was 4 years old. She's at an age where it's really impossible to know exactly how to handle that. And so you have to go by how those around you deal with it. And if they don't deal with it in a particularly healthy way, you don't learn a method. That recalls another factor that's really important. Is I had a patient whose husband one Saturday morning was going to go out and get on his motorcycle and go down to the farmer's market. He said, "What would you like? Would you like some broccoli?" Those last words he said to her. And he got hit on the one way and killed on his way to get broccoli. And she was very aggrieved because she had absolutely no time to prepare for it. Like my first wife, Marilyn, who many of you knew, she was diagnosed 3.5 years before she died. So I had 3.5 years to get ready because I knew from the first diagnosis that she wasn't going to survive that cancer. I hoped she would, but I was almost certain she wouldn't. But I remember the day that particular patient came into my office and she was laughing. And I said, what are you laughing about? She said, well, the last words my husband said to me were, would you like some broccoli? And she was at the point in her grief process where she could actually laugh about it, and instead of just feel tremendous deep pain. So once again, the opportunity to sit with people, to talk about your experiences, to share them, to see how they're dealing with those experiences, how they're processing is really an important part of dealing with the grief. And with depression, when the depression gets severe enough, it's hard to even relate to other people. And in that case, as a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist, I would have to work with people to get them to the point where they could get the advantages of sharing with other people and talking. And again, when there was a conflictual relationship with the person lost, when the person was lost out of order, like a child going before you do, when you don't have much time to get ready for the loss, all of those things complicate the grieving process in a significant way. Okay, I've been going on for quite a while. Are there any questions at this point that anybody has, or comments, reflections?
Take a comment. That thing you were saying about love, it fits with the whole group therapy thing. I mean, that's what it's all. It's also, I would say, it's a terrible what's going on, but in churches these days, I would say churches are all out. How many times did Jesus use the word love? It's what we do here. And it's an old lesson from thousands of years ago. It seems to be flowing. It's too bad.
Say what you just said again. I'm not sure I got it.
Well, that churches do the same. You know, we're here to love each other. That's a societal thing that seems to be going away. It's not. It's
the church is going away.
The church is going away, as well as the and this is where we practice. You know, we practice even if we don't love each other. You know, you come in, it's like the golf course. Compare it to the golf course. Sometimes you're a nice guy on the golf course because you'll ruin that other guy's game, and you'll ruin yours if you start getting horrible thoughts about whatever, you know, or getting upset. And so you come in here and you try to be nice. That's basically what it comes down to. There's not enough of that going in society in general. And the genuine, you know, with the group therapy, it's real sharing that often doesn't happen. As population grows, you know, it's one man's ceiling is another man's floor, and all of that business. You know, it's we learn to maintain our distance from everybody. Having lived in Hong Kong, which is pretty much a giant ant, you know, it's very much that way. Albuquerque, just a little village.
You're going to like today's.
What's that?
I think you're going to like today's sermon.
Okay.
Well, one of the problems with, not problems, but one of the reasons why it's harder to lose somebody that you're angry with, you also lose the chance to make it up.
So Bev said that one of the reasons it's harder to lose somebody that you're having difficulties with, like anger, is because you lose the opportunity to resolve that anger and reach a place that's a more positive place to be. And that's really one of that's I thank you for that, because that's really one of the reasons why losing somebody with whom you're having a conflictual relationship that Freud was talking about in the morning in Melancholia is really right on. You know, I'm realizing as I'm looking at those of you up on the screen that I forgot to ask you for your comments. I don't know if it's too late to do that at this point or not, but I would love to hear something from each of you if you're willing to share.
Okay, I'm certainly willing to say that in our lifetime, which is creeping up there now, we have had a lot of losses and have dealt with them in a variety of ways. But I think the hardest loss we had was the suicide of our son, David. And that happened many years ago, but it's still, for me anyway, I can't speak for Bud, but for me, it's a terrible ache now and then. Certainly not very often, but I wonder if it doesn't form the way I deal with many losses subsequently. I don't know. I ought to think about that.
Holly, can you share a little bit about how you deal with subsequent losses that might have been affected by losing your son?
Well, I tend to be the kind of person that just tries to go forward. I remember when David did die, I stayed home from work for 2 weeks. And then I just made myself go back to work because I was so tired of people coming to my house and trying to pray me through it. Or take me out to lunch. I mean, I
Or
just
bring a
thought,
casserole.
I just thought I had to go back and sort of submerge the grief in the work that I was doing. So that's what I did.
Okay, thank you. How many years ago was that?
Oh, my dear, almost 40 years.
Oh,
It's a long time.
Anybody else who's on Zoom like to share? Go ahead.
I had a lot of problems with family relationships, and I grew up in a military family, Lane, and my father, was that a military thing that said, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about? It seems like, or maybe it was just the sign of the times when we were growing up, but I just felt like I don't remember my father ever expressing love or complimenting me. It was always, everything was focused on what we did wrong, and not just me, but my siblings too. And that had a lot to do, or has had a lot to do with my feelings and my relationships growing up. One of the things that I was impressed with when I met my husband was the fact that his family openly demonstrated love. And I like that. That's one of the things that attracted me to him. Found out that he was military too. And so his father was worse than my father about all of the other stuff. So that's something that I've dealt with all my life, and it's definitely affected my relationship with my own family. But I've had a tendency to keep things inside and not express them, and I'm getting better about that. But goodness gracious, at this point in my life, I should hope that I've made some progress.
Well, good for you. And you bring up the good point that one of the things that we often grieve is how we were treated, or what the conditions were in our family as we grew up. And I've got to say that I'm extremely grateful that my father lived to be 92, because I was able to work on many issues and get to the point where he and I got into a much better place. And my brother, who lived across the country, didn't have that same opportunity on such a regular basis. Yeah, I think he improved his relationship with my father, but it took, took different strategies to do so. So
I never had,
congratulations on your good work, and
I never had the opportunity to come to terms with my dad because, well, I moved out here and my brother, after my husband died, said, well, I was so proud of you. You ran away from home. And I never thought of my moving from Texas out to New Mexico was running away from home. It was an adventure as far as I was concerned, but I never did come to terms with my dad. And I didn't appreciate who he was until I sat and listened to the things that people said about him at his memorial service. So I never had a chance to do that while to come to terms with things when he was alive, but I've come to terms with him since. So I know that I need to get out of here so I can get down there for church. So
Okay.
I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
The rest of you who are on Zoom, would you like to share briefly a little bit? Go ahead.
That's Susan.
Hi there, everybody. I just really appreciate what you told us about having an alcoholic parent and who might be on the mean side when they're using, how much that might have affected our own self-image. Even I'm just thinking about that, and I appreciate what you said.
Thank you.
Lane, I might mention that Susan sat over there on that first time and talked about that when she's 4 years old and when the family members had died and she was not say anything, grieve or anything else. Just a connection for you.
Thank you. And is there one, would you like to share, Anjay?
No.
No? Okay. And Roy? Whomever you're there with? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I am over the time I'm supposed to talk. There's a lot more we could say.
Oh, good.
I know that after the first session a month ago that I came to, I walked downstairs with Bruce's sister, and we had a very meaningful conversation on the way down the stairs about issues that both of us had in our lives. So there's no reason to stop doing that. And as was said, our church community hopefully is one of those places where we can share and heal even wounds that are still with us after many, many years. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your gift, Lane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are you raising your hand or waving?
Oh, waving goodbye.
Bye-bye.
You have a grandfather, no contact whatsoever. We're sort of already, the daughter and I,